Here's a side-scrolling platform game packed with amazing graphics and non-stop action. Demon's Crest.
Released in 1994, Demon's Crest is the third and final game in the Gargoyle's Quest trilogy, though judging by the name alone, you wouldn't know that. Why was the name changed? No one really knows. In fact, there's not a whole lot of information about this game. Not even who worked on it, since there's no credit sequence at the end. It's just a roll call of all the bosses when you beat it. Yes, the other Gargoyle's Quest games had something similar, but they did so in conjunction with the people who worked on them.
Then again, this is Capcom, the company who can't even spell their own name right, so this could just be business as usual for them.
What little is known of it is that Demon's Crest sold incredibly poor in spite of rave reviews that it received at the time. Nowadays, it's considered a collector's item and a classic by those who've played it, but is Demon's Crest a fitting finale for the series? Let's put this trilogy of reviews to rest with Demon's Crest. Unlike the last two games, Demon's Crest doesn't have any explicit connection to Firebrand's previous quest. Instead, it tells the tale of how 6 crests commanding the powers of the very elements themselves descended onto the ghoul realm, sparking a massive war over who would lay claim to them. After a long-fought battle, they found themselves in the hand of Firebrand. For about 5 minutes. Shortly after winning the final crest, this new villain, Phalanx, no, not that one, attacks the battered red blaze and steals all the crests, save for a part of the fire one. So, yet again, Firebrand has to set things right by defeating a new horde of foes before facing off against Phalanx.
Here's something that might sound shocking if you haven't seen the previous two Gargoyle's Quest reviews. The story isn't very good. In fact, this is probably the weakest out of the entire series. Story-wise, I mean.
There's so little tissue to begin with, and what there is doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Say what you will about the last two games, at least they fit within their respective plots. Here we have a villain that could have killed the main character before they became powerful enough to stop them, but doesn't because he's not very smart. That's the only explanation that could exist. Seriously, you have the powers of a god in your hands, and Firebrand is unconscious. Kill him and become the ruler of the realm. There is nothing stopping you from doing this. Now, this isn't a deal breaker because, as the sarcasm may have implied, none of the Gargoyle's Quest games are known for their well-written stories or characters, and that's not the main reason to play any of them. However, that doesn't excuse the story from being bad, let alone a story that was more fleshed out than the previous two games. What does make it easier to overlook is how excellent the actual gameplay portion opens up, with the battle against a giant dragon. This is an epic encounter and a great way to start the game off. Easily one of the best introductions to any video game. It's a challenging boss battle followed by a spectacular opening level that lets those unfamiliar with the series get used to the basic mechanics of jumping, hovering, clinging, and shooting, while veterans will notice one of the many changes to the series' third outing. This time around, pressing the jump button while in midair will cause Firebrand to hover indefinitely. No more need to level up your jump and wings. Which also means no more levels built around the limitations the two gave way to. Like the removal of random encounters in Gargoyle's Quest 2, Demon's Crest removal of this limitation does more harm than good, as we'll soon see. The overworld has seen its own drastic redesign, with Firebrand flying over the stages in glorious Mode 7 graphics. Well, glorious for the time at least. A welcome change in perspective aside, this overworld suffers from the same problem as the one in Gargoyle's Quest 2, namely that the land is completely barren, with almost nothing to do outside of the main stages. While there are minor deviations like the headbutting minigame and shops, the land feels less lively than ever, with only a handful of residents in a single town to speak of in the entire realm, not helped by how much of a pain the precise landing can be. The overworld wasn't the only area that saw major change in the series' third outing. In addition to its usual powers, the titular Crest can grant Firebrand new forms. There's the ground gargoyle who can ram into hard surfaces and cling to walls, but can't hover. It's a decent upgrade from the base form, but aside from a couple of bosses that are weak to its attacks and uncovering some secret areas, it won't be brought out as much as some of the other forms, like the air gargoyle, which can not only hover, but fly. It can't cling to walls, but given how maneuverable it is, that's not really much of a loss. It's the form that you'll be seeing the most usage out of, if only for the wrong reasons. Less commonly seen is the water gargoyle because it's next to useless. Outside of water, it can't cling to walls or hover, but it can swim and is the only gargoyle form that can survive in water. Also, its breath is extremely powerful, you guessed it.
Under the sea, Darling, it's better down where it's wetter. Take it from me.
The other returning powers, well, we'll get to them in a moment. Perhaps the most notable change for Demon's Crest is the shift from challenging platforming to exploration a la Mega Man X and Super Metroid. Much like how the original took its fair share of inspiration from Mega Man, you can see a lot of Mega Man X in Demon's Crest design, from the first area serving as a basic tutorial to the focus on collecting items like talismans that provide a passive boost to Firebrand, or those that allow him to cast spells, and vials for storing potions. This decision comes across as an unnecessary attempt to fix what was never broken, robbing the series of its own identity. Gargoyle's quest was so unique among other platformers at the time, it made any possible ledge into a place to climb and jump off of. It transformed what would normally be an obstacle in most games at the time into a sandbox for the developers to craft intricate levels around, something they did in the past two games very well. In Demon's Crest, the level design is more open-ended, but weaker because there's no real focus on these new Crest or Firebrand's previous abilities. It fails to make any practical use of them outside of the opening level. Now, just so we're clear, the problem is not that Demon's Crest is not like the previous two games. To go back to Mega Man X for a moment, there were a good amount of changes to the mechanics from the NES entries to the Super Nintendo debut, but it worked because the level design made great use out of the new mechanics like wall jumping. Had the same level of polish and execution went into Demon's Crest, there wouldn't have been a problem, but sadly the game is lacking in both areas. Magic either doesn't work as intended, or their intended effect is so ineffectual that you wonder why they included them to begin with. Likewise, the addition of potions wind up being nothing more than eerie E-tags, since all they're useful for is restoring Firebrand to full health. The level design itself isn't bad, but again, it comes across as more generic than its predecessors, substituting walls of skeletons and waves of flames with your standard forest level, water level, ice level, etc. There's a lot less wall clinging and challenging platforming, favoring more action and exploration for a given stage. However, the exploration element is just frustrating, preferring to hide the extra magic, potions, and talismans in places where they're incredibly difficult to find. With the exception of a few underwater segments and the first stage, there aren't many areas that use any Firebrand's new forms or old abilities in any effective manner. There are some secret areas which only the ground, water, or air gargoyle can access, but actually progressing through them either requires swapping between crests or ignoring them after entering these areas altogether, and going into the menu to swap every time you need to change them becomes really annoying. Heck, the air gargoyle makes two of the weapons from the previous games, the tornado and claw, useless for navigating the levels. The tornado wasn't a very potent weapon, but it had its use in letting Firebrand reach higher surfaces, and the claw then turned a hazard like spikes into another platform from which to cling, jump, and hover from. The air gargoyle makes these two negligible. Unless you're looking to unlock the ultimate gargoyle via 100% completion, you can ignore them throughout the entire game. This new crest form in particular is a perfect example of how badly executed a lot of the good ideas in Demon's Crest were pulled off. Again, credit where it's due, there is an attempt to balance out the maneuverability of the air crest with certain bosses by making them immune to damage from it, but by that same token, some of them are surprisingly easy, mostly because of how much free reign it has, but also because they take more damage due to the elemental system at play. It's not quite as broken as, say, the Metal Blades from Mega Man 2, but for a game that features some of those potent excuses to throw a controller at the screen, the difficulty can be incredibly uneven, which may stem from the game letting the player choose which stage to complete and which secret areas they wish to explore. The non-linear nature of Demon's Crest isn't all bad news. Like the aforementioned Mega Man X, if you're having difficulty with a given boss or level, you can go to a previous level to find more health with your new abilities, scour through them for hidden passages and items, or even obtain a new crest or power by fighting another boss. The one area where Demon's Crest bests its predecessors is the presentation. The gothic imagery, the gruesome death for Firebrand, and the brilliantly detailed bosses, it's all breathtakingly beautiful, topped off with a supremely atmospheric soundtrack. It's a shame that so much of it is plagued in periodic slowdown. Now, there was some slowdown in the previous two games, but nowhere near as much as there is here. It happens so often that it becomes absurd how many times it crops up. Thankfully, this doesn't affect the haunting score, but it's a shame that a game as gorgeous as this is drenched in it. Also, for some reason, the red blaze is now orange. Well, that's not right. Clearly, he should be green.
Demon's Crest is a alright platformer that just happened to come out at the same time as some of the greatest games in the genre, like Super Metroid and Mega Man X. As a conclusion to the series, it's underwhelming to say the least, but it's perfectly playable in its own right. Still, it is the weakest game in the Gargoyle's Quest trilogy.
Some might argue that the first game is a weaker experience, but Gargoyle's Quest realized its concept and executed it so well in spite of the Game Boy's limitations. Demon's Crest has great ideas, no doubt, but the execution is lacking, leaving a game that simply does not live up to its predecessors in spite of the Super Nintendo's superior technology. Again, this is not a bad game, but it is hard to recommend it if you haven't played the first 2 Gargoyle's Quest games, and even more so if you have. As mentioned earlier, Demon's Crest is something of a collector's item, with physical copies going for upwards of $100. Thankfully, it's also available on the Wii U Virtual Console for a far more affordable $8.
With that said, I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this All Hallows Eve, and wish you all a happy Halloween. Unless, of course, you're watching this some other day of the year. Well, until next time, as always, Game On. Oh, you know what's coming up next. Yoshi! Oh, and yes, I know I teased in my last review that Chippy Robo Ziplash was going to be the next game to be reviewed, but I delayed that one so I could focus on Demon's Crest and have a quality video out on Halloween. Sorry for the delay, hopefully that review will be out later this week.